All right, welcome everyone to this week's meeting of SABR's East Coast Cooperative, a group of 7 chapters in Eastern Canada and the United States who are working to bring you more great presentations. I'm Bruce McClure, the chair of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter in Maine and New Hampshire, and tonight we have another great speaker for you. 7 decades ago, a promising St. Louis Cardinals rookie named Charlie Peete became the first active major leaguer to lose his life in a commercial plane crash when his flight to Caracas crashed in the mountains of Venezuela in November 1956. Although Peete played only 23 games in the majors, the reigning AAA batting champion was expected to compete for the Cardinals' starting center field job in 1957 and could have become the first black position player in franchise history to start a full season in the everyday lineup. Yet all these years later, Pete's name is shrouded in mystery and obscurity. As one of the first black players in Cardinals history during the franchise's early years of integration, Peete helped lay the groundwork for talented and diverse Cardinal teams of the 1960s that appeared in 3 World Series. Spewak aims to raise greater awareness about Pete's contributions to the sport and his role in integration of professional baseball during a critical time in American history. Danny Spewak is a journalist with more than a decade of experience as a television news reporter in Minneapolis, Buffalo, New York, and Columbia, Missouri. A native of St. Louis and a graduate of the University of Missouri, Spewak is the author of 2 nonfiction books on sports history, both published by Rowman and Littlefield. His first book, From the Gridiron to the Battlefield, Minnesota's March to a College Football Title and into World War II, was a finalist for the Emil Buchwald Award for Minnesota Nonfiction. Spewak's second book, Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete and a Life Cut Short, was published in March 2024, and he is here tonight to give his SABR 52 presentation. Danny Spewak, welcome. How are you?
Bruce, doing well. Thank you so much for having me. This is a real treat to be on with you all, and just thank you for being here and for listening to the story of Charles Peete. I guess I can just get going with the presentation. I've got the screen sharing tested out, so it should work out. But before I start, this book came from being a Cardinals fan and St. Louis native. I was always sort of vaguely familiar with the name Charles Peete, but he only played 23 games, and it was in 1956, a time when the Cardinals were really not very good. It was kind of a drought between their 40s and 60s World Series. So a completely forgotten name in St. Louis. If you walk down the street in St. Louis right now and said, "Who's Charles Peete?" I guarantee you 0% of the population would be able to tell you who he was. But as I learned more about his story, the plane crash, the potential that he had, the importance he had to the organization, I just thought it was a really great baseball story. And regardless of geographic location or teams that we root for, I think he's just a really interesting story, and is kind of a microcosm of baseball itself in the 1950s. So feel free, we'll have plenty of time for questions afterward. Jump in on the chat whenever you need. I'll get the PowerPoint going though, and my screen share. Okay. So we should be good to go here. All right. So Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete and a Life Cut Short is the name of the book. It came out earlier this year, March 2024. Rowman and Littlefield was the publisher. And like I mentioned, I started working on this probably around 2022. Just this idea of who was Charlie Peete, what was his story, what could he have been? This is such a what if story of could he have been, one of the next great stars out of the National League? We'll never get to know, unfortunately. So to give you a little bit of the overview, Bruce told you a little bit about it, but Charlie Peete was a major leaguer, but only for 23 games in St. Louis. So he was a minor league star who had gotten promoted in the summer of 1956 for the Cardinals. After the season, when he was expected to come back for spring training in 57 for his true rookie season, he was killed in a plane crash in November 1956. He was on his way to play winter baseball in Venezuela, which he had done the year before as well. And what a lot of players did back in those days, as I'm sure you know. He was probably considered the leading candidate to be the starting center field position in 1957. The team was very high on him. He hadn't played all that well in his tryout, basically his 23-game tryout in 1956, but his defense was terrific. He was the minor league batting champion in the American Association in 1956 when he was in the minors, aside from when he was called up to the majors for a month. So great potential. left a lasting legacy, really, and one of his true legacies for the Cardinals, who were very late in integrating at the time under new ownership in the 50s. He left a lasting legacy as among the first Black players to put on a Cardinals uniform. And I'll get to at the end. What I think from a baseball standpoint is among the most interesting things about him is that when he died, there was a complete void in center field in 1957, and after the 1957 season, the Cardinals traded for Curt Flood. And so there's a debate as to if Pete were to live, does Curt Flood come to the Cardinals from Cincinnati? Does that legal Supreme Court case ever go forward? And of course, the implications that had for free agency and everything in baseball. So that kind of gives him a little more stature as his context in baseball history. So we'll start with his early life. He was born in 1929 in Franklin, Virginia. So he was from the Tidewater area of Virginia, if anybody's familiar. He really grew up in Portsmouth, which is right across the river from Norfolk. And as the locals say, as I learned when I visited there, he was nicknamed Pistol Pete. Of course, this was a time of segregation, and so his opportunities were limited to semi-pro, really African-American leagues. He was a star in those leagues in the semi-pro circuit, was also a great football player, but really played all positions, was a five-tool player and among the better players on the circuit. In 1950, he signed with the Indianapolis Clowns. So he started his career in the Negro Leagues in 1950. Of course, the Clowns were sort of a famous traveling circuit, and he only played a couple of months with them before going to the Brandon Grays, which was a fascinating aspect of his life, way out in Western Canada in Manitoba. And with Brandon, he also made a name for himself in 1950, but then the Korean War hit. So he's just started his career. He's then sent overseas. His military record is almost impossible to figure out. All the archives were burned down in a fire, coincidentally, in St. Louis many years ago. And so there's like one document that I could find of where he was in the war. He was somewhere over in Korea and Japan and actually played baseball over there. And so that was where he said, I think he was quoted in one of his documents that he wrote that the Hall of Fame preserved in Cooperstown. So he said that it was in the Army where he really felt like he kind of found his hitch as a baseball player. So anyway, he's in Korea and Japan over there overseas until the Korean War ends. And then he comes back home. So of course he's cut off from, much of daily life in segregated Virginia before the Korean War. But the war, World War II and the Korean War really, you had, the integration of the troops that began under Harry Truman. And it really changed society in a way that finally by the mid early 50s, finally, even some of these Southern teams and these Southern minor leagues are starting to integrate. That was the case for his hometown in Portsmouth, Virginia. He helps to integrate that Class B league, sort of a middling minor league at the time, and is a real star in that league in 1953 and 1954. Here's a shot of Charles Peete here on the left. That's him with the Brandon Grays up in Manitoba in the Mandak League, as it was called, which is kind of a hidden gem. If anybody's interested, look up the Mandak League. Some amazing players played out there, if anybody's ever heard of that. Leon Day was in that league. Willie Wells was in the league. So a lot of great African-American players at the time would go up to Canada because it was just a better climate for them as opposed to America of the 1950s. So then in late 1954, Charles Peete, who you can see here, if it's on your left, I think it's the same as mine. He's at the very bottom. It's kind of hard to see him with the cap on, but that's Charles Peete. He was drafted by the Cardinals organization in late 54, and he played in two different AAA teams, first in Rochester, New York, and then in Omaha, Nebraska. So that was in 1955 and 56. This is a picture of the team from 55. Johnny Keane is actually the manager here, who of course was the World Series manager for the Cardinals in 1964. He was the manager of Omaha on the minor league level at the time. I'm trying to see if there's any other really kind of notable players. You may look at some of the names and recognize some of them. But Charles Peete comes in and he goes straight to AAA. So he's been a star at this Class B league. Now he's really in a major league organization, and he is really, among the first Black players under owner Gussie Busch. So Gussie Busch, who was the head of Anheuser-Busch, takes over the team in the mid 50s, and much different than his predecessor, finally opens up the team and the organization to African-American players. Tom Alston, who is up there on the top row, was the first major leaguer, first Black major leaguer to play for the Cardinals. And, Peete really emerged as a star in 55 and then especially in 1956 when he was really one of the leading hitters in the American Association. Played against some great players at the time. Whitey Herzog was actually in that league. Tommy Lasorda was in that league at the time. And so A lot of players that became famous later in life for various reasons. Peete became part of that. This is a picture that was in the Historical Society in Minnesota, actually, which is, I happen to live in Minnesota, and there's not many connections to him in Minnesota, but this was him playing against the Minneapolis Millers at the time. You can see him sliding, kind of shows he was an aggressive base runner, very fast, and was known for kind of a daring base running style. So then we get to 1956. So Peete is the leading hitter basically in the American Association for the Omaha Cardinals, and he's promoted to the St. Louis Cardinals in July of 1956. His first game is against the Pittsburgh Pirates, and Bob Friend is the pitcher that he's facing in St. Louis at the old Sportsman's Park that they eventually named Busch Stadium. So, he can't sugarcoat it. He didn't really hit very well in 23 games. He hit 192 in 23 games. Had his moments. He had a triple that was a go-ahead triple against Robin Roberts of the Phillies. He had some, 3-hit game against Pittsburgh at one point. So he wasn't, totally worthless as a batter, but, he was brand new to this. And, it was his first taste of the majors. He was acclimating. He was dealing with a little bit of a thumb injury. Really where he made his mark, though, was in the field. And if you look at Sporting News or many of the other archives, his center field defense and his arm and his range was really considered top notch and really was flawless at the major league level. He didn't make any errors in any of those games. So he struggled at the plate, which may be expected for a rookie, but was a great fielder. He threw out 2 Dodger base runners in the same game. Was able to play against Jackie Robinson in Robinson's final season in 1956, which was a thrill for him because he had grown up really idolizing Robinson and had tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers actually at one point when he was in semi-pro because of Robinson's influence. So, of course, when you hit 192 in 23 games, they don't necessarily keep you up there for the rest of the season. The Cardinals weren't having a great year. So they demoted him back to Omaha in August, and he won the American Association batting title, hit 350. And was really probably the premier hitter in that league, and entered 1957 on the active roster for the Cardinals. Was expected to be the starting center fielder potentially in 57. So then, of course, the tragedy hits. We all know it's coming, and it was kind of when you're writing the book. Actually, the whole the reason I got into the book was knowing the story of the plane crash, but it's a little hard to write about because you get very invested in him. And it was a sad, sad thing, just a terrible, terrible tragedy that occurred November 27th, 1956. He was with his whole family heading to Venezuela for a winter league. He had been cut from a Cuban team, and instead of just going straight to Venezuela, he decided to go back and get his family in the United States. And then they flew out of what is now called JFK in New York City. And that flight on the way to Caracas, they were almost there, almost to the airport, and bad weather. The pilot made an error, and they crashed and killed 25 people. You can see here it was a major story. This was on the front page of the New York Times. The Associated Press obviously picked it up. It was the headline in every major newspaper where he had played. And it took on a prominence because he was, of course, affiliated with a major league team. So you can see some of those clippings. Really awful. His wife and 3 young kids all died in the crash. So very, very tragic, and was a major news story at the time. It was even the general manager of the Cardinals at the time, Frank Lane, who was the one that called the family to actually tell them of the news of the crash. They hadn't heard yet. So it was just devastating to the Cardinals, and of course to anyone in Major League Baseball who knew about Charles Peete, despite the fact that he'd only played 23 games. This is actually a clipping from one of the Venezuelan newspapers. And when I presented this at SABR 52 in Minneapolis, there was actually somebody who was a Spanish speaker who read this and was actually translated it for me, kind of in real time, what this was. So that's him playing, and I think the year before when he played in Venezuela, and they still had a picture of him. People still remembered him, and it was a major story, of course, the plane crash that occurred there in 56. So his legacy, is many things, but he was, to my knowledge, the first active major leaguer to be killed in a commercial plane crash. I can't find any others. I know that's kind of a specific thing. There've been people that have been killed in military accidents in aviation, but Peete was the first that was on a commercial plane crash, as that was starting to become more of a thing in the 50s. But he really, paved the way for the groundbreaking teams of the 1960s. We won't bring up 67, but of course the Cardinals had a lot of success in the 60s. But Peete, if you think about it, he was a little bit older than a traditional rookie. He was 27 when he was killed. So there's kind of a thought that, well, he was kind of, an older rookie, no matter what, what was really his potential. But you have to remember, he served in the war for 2 years. He faced early discrimination at the minor league level, so it delayed him by probably 4 or 5 years, actually getting to the major league level. But he came in that first wave of African American players, and it was right after him that Bob Gibson and Lou Brock and Bill White and all of those great players came after him and really set a tone in the 60s under Johnny Keane when he did take over. That really had the Cardinals were really kind of considered I think a groundbreaking team, especially that 64 World Series. They defeat the Yankees that at the time were mostly a white team. And it was kind of kind of a way for the future for Major League Baseball. The Cardinals really kind of a landmark team, and Pete could have been part of that. He could have been a veteran at that point. All indications were he was a good enough player to stick around in the majors for a while. And when he came up that day in July 1956, he told the newspaper he wanted to retire as a Cardinal. So just sad that he never got to live that out. And in his hometown, there is a Charles Peete Little League in his hometown of Portsmouth, Virginia. And there's a field named after him. And I had a chance to go meet some of the coaches and things that have coached in that league for a long time. I see a couple chats here, so I'm going to see if, we'll do Q&A at the end. Just the last, kind of thing I want to talk about is the Curt Flood connection, because, Pete in 56 is killed in the plane crash, and 57, they moved Ken Boyer from third base to center field, just this temporary thing in the 57 season. And then after the season, they went out and they got Curt Flood from Cincinnati, who had been an infielder at times, but they decided maybe they could put him in center field because they didn't have a center fielder. So really interesting to think about what would have happened if Pete, does what many expected him to do. He's the starting center fielder. Do the Cardinals never trade for Curt Flood? Does Curt Flood never end up playing for the Cardinals for all those World Series teams in the 60s, get traded to Philadelphia, start the whole free agency situation and the Supreme Court challenged for free agency? So I think in that sense, it's a completely hidden, unknown name, Charles Peete, that most baseball fans would have no reason of knowing. But I just hope that the book is able to bring some awareness to who he was. He doesn't have really a lot of family around because sadly, his entire family was killed in the plane crash. So there's no like children or even grandchildren that are around to tell his story. There's just kind of some relatives that are sort of peripherally connected to him that have tried to keep his legacy alive. But I was able to talk to a lot of sort of his old friends, one of his old coaches who was 97 years old, who remembered him. So he's a name that is very much remembered in Virginia, in that area of Virginia, and hopefully by more baseball fans as well. So that's my whole PowerPoint here, but I would love to take questions and just kind of discuss if anybody's got anything they want to share.
If you have a question for our presenter, Danny Spewak, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. When you hit react, you'll see raise hand. You can raise your hand and get in line to ask a question of our presenter tonight. One of the things I noticed when I went into Baseball Reference just a minute ago is that Charlie never came through the Negro leagues. He played 2 years in the minor leagues for St. Louis and hit well over 300 each year. And he started in AAA.
Mm-hmm.
That's astounding to me. No experience. This kid's coming into AAA and hitting lights out and winning batting titles.
Yeah, it was kind of incredible. He had that maybe 30 games with the Indianapolis Clowns, but he really barely played. I mean, you can barely find his name in any of the archives. He basically went from Korean War to like a sort of a middling minor league, and he comes straight to AAA and he does really well. And that was a point of pride for a lot of people back home. I think he had always known he was a great player. He just really maybe never got the opportunity. But I think that does speak to the tools that he had, the kind of player that he was. He just, he had a lot of potential, and we'll just never know. That's the thing. And, who knows, He maybe would have flamed out after a season, but he also could have been a star.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the better way of putting it is none of his, action in the Negro leagues has really been documented correctly and officially and all of that. Mm-hmm. Baseball Reference doesn't show any of his numbers from that time at all.
Yeah, that would make sense too, because even in the newspapers, there were times where if anyone's ever used the newspapers.com archives, you put in the name and sometimes it would be misspelled or it was so grainy that he wouldn't come up. So I had to go manually through all, and I would see his name there and 0 for 1 pinch hitting, so he was just played so sparingly. There was really almost no information for him.
How did you grab Charlie Peete as a topic for a research presentation like this? Because he seems like such a unknown in Major League Baseball history, probably one of the bigger could have beens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was really what I really gravitated to, was the idea that he hadn't been written about. Because I'd done a football book, and I'm big Cardinals fan, so I wanted to do something Cardinals related. But everybody's written about Musial and Gibson, and that stuff's kind of already been done. So I was vaguely knew. I don't know if anybody will remember, in 2014 there was a young Cardinals player named Oscar Taveras. He was killed in a plane crash. If you remember that was a pretty big story. That was the first time I ever came across the name Charles Peete. That was 10 years ago. And the mention kind of reignited those thoughts of him, because this was another young outfielder who'd been killed in was a car crash in the Dominican, I think. But yeah, that got me going with, I vaguely knew the name Charles Peete, and I thought, well, there's been some articles and things written about him. Somebody did a SABR profile on him, but I was like, there's never really been anything more than just, kind of brief articles. And I just thought, I think this could really be a book. And I think that his story could really be told in a bigger way, really diving into who he was and what he accomplished too, despite his tragic ending.
I accidentally muted myself. It's a professional act. Let's let's talk to a Cardinals fan here. Our resident
Great.
Cardinals fan is here tonight. My pal Andy Heckroth. Andy, how you doing?
Doing great, and thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Danny, for the presentation. I was fortunate enough to have seen the presentation in Minneapolis.
Oh, you did? Oh, great.
Back in August, and I never had the chance. I never had the chance to ask a question, but Bruce invited me tonight, so I was curious. My big question was, and this is a bit in depth, because I saw the picture of the 1955 team with Charlie and Tom Alston. Did you in your research ever find anything such as, were they good teammates? Were they good friends with each other? Since they were both since they were both in the Cardinals organization?
That's a really good question. And I looked really hard to find like anything that they had talked about. The problem with Peete, especially, is because he died so young. He didn't leave behind like a lot of stuff, a lot of other players you're doing research, and they gave interviews later in life and oral histories, and there wasn't really anything for that. So I never really got anything where he talked about Tom Alston, other than he filled out a questionnaire with the Hall of Fame that was kind of like a treasure trove of stuff. He never mentioned Alston, and Alston, of course, was a very tragic story. He had a lot of mental illness later in life, and yes, died prematurely as well. And so he didn't have a lot that he left behind either. So the direct answer to your question is I can't find anything where they talked about each other, but I know that when they were in Omaha, there were a lot of articles written about how they were kind of, they were almost like kind of considered like almost like a package deal, because they were two really great players, and of course, two trailblazers. So it was a big deal. I know in a lot of like the African-American newspapers in Omaha, they talked about in 55, of course, that was that was around the same time as Emmett Till. So civil rights movement is, really accelerating. And they talked about that, the fact that here were the biggest news stories of the year in Omaha, nationally, here's what happened. And then also, that we had these two players. So I can tell you that they were known to be kind of great teammates together and groundbreaking, but I will never know what their relationship was like. And I wish we had some evidence of that.
All right, let's take our next question from Ryan McClanahan. Ryan, how you doing this evening? What's that?
Good.
Yep, go.
Thank you. Hey, Danny. This is great. Thank you very much. I think what your book is going to be doing is to keeping his memory alive and sharing it with other people who might not know who he is. I've never actually heard of him myself, but did you ever talk to Bill White, or did you know if Bill White had actually ever talked about Charles Peete at all?
That's another good question. I tried to find Bill White because he's still alive. I couldn't get through to him, but I did read his book cited his book because he had an autobiography, and he never talked about Peete specifically. I'm sure he would have to remember him. I always wanted to talk to him. But he kind of did talk a little bit about like what just it was like playing for the Cardinals in St. Louis in the late 50s and in the 60s. But no, I never did get to talk to Bill White. Another gentleman was Bill Greason, who, if anybody watched that Rickwood Field game that the Cardinals and the Giants played in earlier this year, they had featured him. He's also would have known Pete and played around the same time, but he didn't want to do any interviews, and so we'll never know if anybody any of those players knew him. I'm sure they did. I'd have to think they would know the name if they if they were reminded of it now.
Thank you very much.
Sure, of course.
Paul Hensler had a comment for you this evening. I want to go to him. Paul, you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Paul's camera shy tonight.
Oh, how's that?
There he is. Holy moly, made it.
I can shut it off if you like.
It's, you know what? You said that, I didn't. They haven't kicked me off camera yet. You're going to stay on. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. Danny, nice presentation, and looking at it, a very unusual aspect of the game with through a tragedy. I looked up a couple of things very quickly before you started tonight, and one thing that popped into my mind, I'm glad that you addressed the issue about Curt Flood being traded to St. Louis as a successor, if you will, to Pete. To carry that one step further, if you imagine that Curt Flood doesn't get traded, and you have an outfield of the Reds of Beta Pinson, Curt Flood in center, and Frank Robinson in right. This is the fulfillment, if you will, of Coach George Pohl's McClymonds High School team out in Oakland, who had those three players at not quite the same time, but all under his tutelage. And that would be quite a triumvirate to have an outfield of high school alumni from that one place, and all of them having wonderful all-star careers.
Yes, absolutely. That is something. There's so many different what ifs. Like, what would that have meant for Cincinnati? And just I think that actually I remember reading. I don't know if this is true. I know there was at the time some criticism that there was a belief that Cincinnati felt like they had too many black players or something like that. So there may have been a racial aspect involved in discrimination of why they traded him. It is incredible though to think about what that outfield would have been like in Cincinnati, and just what that would have meant for, for Major League Baseball as a whole. Cincinnati would have, that would have been great for them. Who knows what maybe Pete would have been better than Flood, maybe been a lot worse. Who knows? Just, you can kind of run through so many different scenarios, and especially with the free agency thing, I always think, I'm sure it would have happened eventually, but Flood really definitely accelerated it.
And interesting too that Pete is almost the same age as a rookie that Jackie Robinson was, because he broke in as an old rookie, if you will.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, that was the other thing too, was, he would have been 28 even in his 1957 season. So I don't know if that would have limited his potential, but yeah, it was just a different era. And he just had so many different interruptions in his career. It's just, if you think he was, even five years older, would it have just been way more streamlined? He could have maybe been in the majors, at age 23, 24, and that might have really changed things.
And with expansion on the rise too in 61 and 61, 62 for both AL and NL.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
Yep. I looked it up. The SABR Bio Project does have Charlie Peete. The article was written by Joe Schuster years ago. Pretty extensive bio. Nice work by him. If you get a chance, go to SABR.org and you can look that up. Let's go to Dixie Tarango. Dixie, how you doing?
Fine.
You're up.
Danny, you've just proven once again that even guys who played 23 games have great stories behind.
Yeah, that's very true. Yes. Well, thank you. Very well said.
You write histories of guys for SABR Bio, especially just on guys that played 20 games or fewer than that. The stories are out there.
Yeah.
From a writer's standpoint, since you had already done a book, was there any time, especially during your gathering of information at the beginning, that you thought maybe there isn't enough information for a book?
Yeah, actually, yes. Several times I was thinking, I was like, I was like, what am I going to do? Like, I don't have, luckily this book, I always said this book could not have been written maybe like 15 years ago, pre-internet archives of newspapers. There's no way I would have been able to find just the gems you're able to find from each of his stops. The fact that newspapers from like all of the places he played are mostly available online with a subscription was a huge game changer. But yeah, there were times where I was like, especially when I was realizing there wasn't a lot of family around. There are some family members, but there's not anyone that's like kind of keeping his story, like, the main caretaker of the story. And it was difficult to connect with them. It's just so many generations removed, and just not a ton of people that kind of know him. I had to really look for it. But once I really started digging around in Virginia and able to make a trip out there, that really helped, because then it was, walking down the street, or just, somebody knows somebody, and the Little League was popular, so the name is fairly well known. And, oh, this guy coached there in the 50s, or this guy coached there in the 40s, so that really helped. And then one of the things, it was only like a 2 or 3 page document, but there was this questionnaire I've been talking about that's from Cooperstown. Everybody who played a game in the majors had to fill it out. And that, even these short responses were really enlightening. Like, who's your idol as a player? He said Stan Musial, because he's a great gentleman, or a great all-around player. Or, talking about, where did you start in the minor leagues? And he even wrote, sort of these, short sentences of just, one-line answers, that were illuminating. And then there was a part about his family where he talked a lot about his wife and his kids, and he was just a devoted family man, and that really humanized him. And even without that 1 or 2 page document, I might have like given up, just like, there's nothing. But that ended up, just that short little thing, like a 3-paragraph thing that he wrote, that helped just be his own words, and it kind of like told me a little bit about who he was. So yeah, once I just sort of, got a lot of the archives going, a lot of the newspaper research, it all kind of came together. But there were definitely some doubts at times of like, is there enough information? As a friend of mine said, it's like you're kind of like chasing a ghost in some ways. So that's definitely how it felt.
I bet every time you found one of those gems, you probably said to yourself, maybe this was meant to be.
Yes, and that was probably one of the best parts of the project, was discovering something I didn't know, or like communicating with somebody in Manitoba, Canada, who still had a lot of his dad's archives, and his dad had played with Pete on that Manitoba, the Canadian team. So then he sent me a bunch of that, and just the puzzle pieces all kind of came together.
Show them the book, man. Tell us how to get it.
Yes. So the book, let's see if I got that one right over here. Here it is in the flesh. I even got that behind me too. So it's really anywhere. Roman and Littlefield, you can buy it directly from them. Amazon, it's available. Barnes and Noble, Walmart, anything that, if you just Google it. And then usually if your local bookshop can usually get it in stock. I'm trying to think even if there's a library in the area that has it, but yeah, and there's ebook too. No audio version, but yeah, you should be able to find it most major places.
You know me, I always advocate for our members to go to their local bookstore as opposed to a chain. Keep local businesses working and keep them open. So that would be a good thing. Anybody else have anything for Danny tonight? All right. Well, we have 2 great presentations for you next week. Monday, October 14th, we'll have fellow SABR member and chapter secretary John Bauer with us to give his SABR 52 presentation entitled Charles Comiskey in St. Paul and the Road to the American League. And on Wednesday, October 16th, we'll have Steve Treater in, who will give us his Minneapolis discussion, the Giants, the A's, and Silicon Valley. Each meeting starts at 7 p.m. Eastern, and you can sign up for them in the SABR events calendar at sabr.org/events. Finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to our uploads. And if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Danny Spewak, you are fantastic. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you. Let's get everybody out of here so they can watch some playoff baseball. Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you next week.